podcast with Danielle. First of all, thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find me on Spotify or Apple Music, but definitely subscribe, or you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. But today we're talking with Stu Wolf, who comes from our security practice, security and transformation. And we're talking all things segmentation, network segmentation. What do we do with devices? How do we protect devices from talking to each other? And some of the nuances that we're learning, and then what, technically speaking, Stu can teach us, because we don't know everything. We don't understand it all. But we're going to talk through how networks are designed, why segmentation is so important, and how is it relevant to the healthcare industry. So Stu, thank you for being on the show today. Stu and I do work together at Cisco. How are you today, Stu?
I'm great. Thanks for having me today, Danielle. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Me too. I feel like we can educate a lot of people, especially in the healthcare industry. Tell us a little bit about your background, and how did you become such a guru in security?
I started in this industry back in '93, actually, and I was more a system engineer on the IT side of the house. I actually got into security in the late '90s. One of my customers had an audit exposure where they couldn't send data over the internet unencrypted, and I was an email specialist, so I actually became an encryption specialist for email and how to protect data when it went over the internet, and that got me into security. And then I never really looked back. I mean, from there, I was on the ethical hacking team, a professional pen tester, identity management architect. I've been a consultant in the Big Four, multiple different roles over my career, including consulting as well, too, developing strategy. The healthcare industry is an interesting area for me. I've been focused on that now for the last 7 years. I also kind of on a selfish level want healthcare to be secure, because if I ever have to go into a hospital, I wouldn't want to be impacted by systems that are attacked by malicious hackers, and I want my sensitive information to be protected. So, I'm very interested in healthcare, and I also have aging parents that are also reliant on healthcare, and it's also important from that perspective as well. So definitely on a personal level and on a professional level.
Definitely. And you just said you worked at the Big Four, which we know the Big Four consultants that are out in the marketplace. But why Cisco, right? Why are you working at Cisco in our security practice compared to the Big Four at this point?
Well, so different focus, right? So the Big Four develops a lot of strategy. They have good alignment with the business. What I found, though, was that we were not driving outcomes for customers fast enough, right? We weren't resolving problems fast enough. So I wanted to be able to work for a company where I could take a business problem that a customer has, but then actually implement technology to be able to, or it could be people, process, and technology, to be able to address a problem and solve something for a customer, move them further ahead. A lot of customers have been assessed, almost assessed to death, where a lot of, people come in and said, hey, this is what you need to do. And they're like, okay, awesome. And then you go away and nothing ever happens. They either have competing priorities, they don't have the budget to be able to do things. And so you have all this sort of roadmaps that they need to consolidate, and they need staff, because there's a cybersecurity shortage right now in the world. There's 3 million people short globally, and I believe around 800,000 short in the Americas. So they need help, and they need help to be able
They need
to,
people.
they need people. They need to be in healthcare especially. I mean, it impacts patient lives. So we really need to make sure that things are in fact secure.
Yeah. And you talked about the Big Four. They tell you how, but they don't tell you the why, right? So they tell you how to do it, but how do you actually get to that end result? And I think that's what you were alluding to, right? Cisco really comes in and tells you how to get it done and does it.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
making change. Yeah.
we have the SMEs to actually do the technology, implement, install the technology. And also as Cisco, because we're also a manufacturer, we can, configure, and we have that direct access to the people that created the actual technology as well, right? So should there be any, configuration requirements or additional features that are needed, we can do that as a Cisco company for our customers. So definitely a really big benefit.
Yeah, and really leaning into the BU if we need software upgrades or something needs to happen or a refresh, right? So there's multiple layers of teams when we're addressing, how to accomplish, a major business problem, and
Absolutely.
security being one of them we hear about so much. So, talk about some of the attacks, right? You talked about attacks coming in from other
Yeah.
countries. Why do you feel like healthcare is such a big target, right? What makes you so worried that you would start addressing if you were listening to this?
Traditionally, I would say that healthcare has been more focused on patient outcomes, which is obviously critical.
They need
But
people,
right.
you know,
But
coming back or
yeah, but IT systems do infect patient outcomes, and traditionally healthcare hasn't spent a lot on IT, and security in most industries, including healthcare, has a fairly small portion of the overall IT budget. In healthcare, typically it's somewhere around 6%. And a lot of the organizations struggle on how they can actually be able to calculate how much security actually really costs. So, for example, if you lose data, patient data, and it's sold on the black market, what does that actually really cost you? So, a lot of um, justification needs to be done to show the success of your investments. That's probably part of good security program, good security governance, to be able to then get more budget that you need to be able to, solve problems and protect patients. And so, that's one challenge. The other thing is that medical data itself on the black market is actually worth the most, right? So if you
oh, it is.
compare, oh yeah, if you take like the cost of a, credit card, on the black market, you could
Right.
probably sell it for maybe, $3 to $6 a record. Healthcare, you can probably get 38, $40, maybe even more, because the healthcare information you can use to create passports and do other things. Whereas with credit card data, I mean, as soon as they revoke your card, not much you can do on that side, right? But you can do a ton of stuff with healthcare information. Um, so, we're actually seeing also the third piece is we're seeing a lot of ransomware attacks against healthcare. And part of that is just because of lack of hygiene, lack of investment in security, a lot of old antiquated equipment, investments made in other areas and not necessarily in IT and security. And so a lot of the systems that were made, and also the refresh cycle is long on the medical device side. So you may have old medical equipment that's running Windows XP that you can't get a vulnerability fix for, that can't password protect, that can't encrypt data, and is vulnerable to attack. And that would be a great launching point as a hacker. And as speaking as a former hacker, to be able to land on that specific device, whether it's an MRI machine or whatever it happens to be, and be able to then go through the network and be able to exfiltrate out data that I want, personal information. Cyber attacks happen as well for malicious reasons, cyber terrorism, right? So stories of pacemakers being hacked or IV drips being hacked and distributing more medicine than you should. There's actually a great YouTube video that's actually done, I believe it was done in Israel. They did a simulated exercise of a hacker going into a hospital, sitting in the patient area, which is completely open and not protected. And
Mhm.
quite often hospitals, in ER, they're running around. And so, this person was able to actually go into an MRI room, put a device in the floor called a Raspberry Pi device, and do something called a man in the middle attack. So I'll actually, the link you can check out and you can Google it on the internet. But um,
We'll put it in the notes section so everyone can
yeah.
watch it.
Well, what they actually did was they actually proved that you could actually take a MRI scan that had cancer in it and remove the cancer in the image before the radiologist actually gets to see it, or vice versa. You can put cancer into the image before the person gets to see it. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff you don't want to see, right? With ransomware, there's actually been studies that have actually proven that there's a higher rate of deaths just simply because you have to delay surgeries because they use technology in surgeries. You can't do patient intake. If I'm in ER and I can't speak and you don't know what I'm allergic to from a medical perspective, what medicines I can have, you can't do patient intake. So they actually found a direct relationship between delays in surgeries and increased deaths caused by ransomware. And now on the medical network, we're starting to see a lot of these old antiquated systems, as I mentioned, running Windows XP and others that aren't patched that are now vulnerable to attack and vulnerable to ransomware attack, which is, probably the last thing that you want to happen to your medical equipment. So, those are
Stu,
a lot of the challenges.
having healthcare networks, right, so complex, having so many medical devices connected to the network, right? How does ransomware really get in? What's the number one culprit, number two culprit, and maybe how can you prevent against that?
Well, so the human link is always the biggest problem, right? So people are always the biggest challenge.
People.
So you get users that click on things and all of a sudden you have a ransomware outbreak, right? We get that all the time as an SMS text message, look at the URL. A lot of it's user awareness training. If I get a QR code and I scan it with my phone, it's hard for me to tell whether or not that QR code is malicious or not. It's just a bunch of images or dots, right? So what do you do? So there's a lot of training that's required. A lot of ransomware spreads that way, right? We see a lot actually that are COVID specific, that are used to
Oh,
actually,
interesting.
yeah, please donate to this cause. We're seeing that now
Right.
with the Ukraine war. Um, and people click on a link and it's a malicious link that tries to, get information from you or even affect you with ransomware. And, COVID-19, tons of health messages, there's a cure, click on this or whatever. Um, and, so teaching people not to do that is really kind of the critical thing, right? That's really the most important piece. Um, and
And
then,
you do it through training. You said it. You got to train your employees. You got to, obviously invest more to teach them what that looks like, right? What's a good URL? What's a bad URL? What should you click on? What should you not click on? I mean, on my phone, I know I just check email addresses, and if it's a wonky email address, I just don't,
right.
just delete it. I mean, there's notifications now. There's apps send you notifications. I'm sure there's a lot more of it, but
Yeah.
as
And
people, we try to do our own, defending, right, and protecting. But I couldn't imagine doing it from an entire hospital.
no, and it's always, people, process, and technology, right?
Yeah.
So, um, as far as like, about 400 hospitals in Canada and the US have been subject to ransomware attacks since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, right? So that's huge.
I couldn't even imagine how much money we have given these hackers.
Yeah, and the other challenge that we have is that a lot of ransomware hackers, because they are obviously malicious in nature, even if you pay, say, in Bitcoin to unlock some machines, they don't always give you the decryption key. So which means that you now are in even bigger trouble, right? You would think that if you paid, you would get that decryption key. That's not always the case. And I've seen, complete organizations. We have a hospital that's not far from me, and they chose not to pay the hackers, which is actually what, the right thing to do because you don't want to fund the bad guys, right? You don't want to fund the
But they
terrorists.
get, but they're worried they're down, right? And they're on paper and the hospital's scrambling, but
They had
there is
17,
teams.
well, they had
Yeah, go on.
17,000 machines they had to reimage,
Yeah.
right?
And getting that back up, right? They get nervous, they get scared. But what is your advice if they do get that email and that comes across the CEO's desk? Do you say, don't respond and wait and get a team in and see if you can, rebuild, protect, and against? So what is your advice there if a CEO is listening to this?
So, a lot of organizations, including at Cisco, we have user awareness training on what to look for. And if you do find something, there's this website you can go to report it. And then the security
Oh, great.
teams, yeah, and the security team gets involved and looks at that. Banks also have the same thing. Somebody tries to phish you, doing a phishing attack, for example, with the banks, you can take that URL and you can report that to the bank itself, and then their security teams will get involved and do investigations as well. So that's really your best route, right? And then, our Cisco Talos incident response teams,
Yeah.
we have a red team offering where we actually go out and we can do ransomware simulated testing against healthcare organizations or other companies to see whether or
Mhm.
not, in fact, they are susceptible to attack. So we look for the weakest point. You can then take that information and then use that from a training perspective and say, okay, we tried this. We pretended that we were somebody calling up and we sent you an email and then as a follow-up and you clicked on this link and you really shouldn't have clicked on this link and why did you click on this link and these are the things that you can look for, right? And so we can do all that kind of stuff, right? So it's definitely an increasing problem that's out there within the healthcare environment, and it's increasing every year. I mean, year by year, there's millions of bottom line, cybersecurity, malicious attacks is a $1 trillion business. I mean,
Yep.
it truly is. And you're also seeing mafia that are in that business, Russian mafia, Italian mafia, because it's new ways of generating revenue. And there's also, hacking as a service, which is a cloud type of service. So if you want to launch a denial of service attack, for example, against a hospital, you don't need to have a lot of knowledge. You can actually go on the internet. They have, a platform that's fully has SLA driven that you can launch attacks and you pay a monthly charge just like you would with any other security as a service type offering. And it's very easy to do and you don't need a lot of, education or knowledge on how to do that. Now, I never really figured out how you would collect your SLA penalty from a criminal organization. That part's interesting. But I'm just saying, that's part of the challenge out there, right? So.
Meaning there's, such savviness on how to make money, how to, infiltrate these organizations, and people pay to do that, right? And it's a scary world that people want to attack these healthcare industries, the healthcare networks. But going back to like the networks, right? You spoke about all these connected devices. You talked about refresh and cycles. Why is it so important to look at the cycles, to look at software on all these devices? And then how do you come to a resolution? Like, how do you start fixing um, that problem? Because we hear it a lot. We know that this is a major piece. We're trying to educate, but what advice do you have there?
So, you know, when you have medical environments where either the manufacturers haven't embed security when they develop the actual devices, which happens a lot. And actually at Cisco, we have a chip to cloud offering where we help companies, manufacturers to actually reverse engineer their products before they're shipped. But of course, like anything in security, there's always a constant cycle of the bad guys trying to hack stuff, even if you ship it out the door and it's good. So you need to have a good program of being able to scan the environment to be able to determine vulnerabilities on these devices. So at Cisco, we partner with a few companies to do that. They can understand different medical devices that don't communicate in the same way that you would see on the IT side of the house. So it's very highly
Okay.
specialized type of equipment. And the problem is, even if you identify a problem, you may not be able to get a particular fix for that specific device. So it still could be vulnerable. So it's kind of, doctor, you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you have a problem. And you go, okay, well, what's my cure? And he said, well, there is no cure. That can happen on the medical device side as well. And so then what you want to do is you want to be able to, and this is where Cisco kind of really comes in, is you want to be able to take that device and not necessarily take it off the network. You need to use your MRI machines or whatever it happens to be. Um, you need to segment it off the network so that it's not vulnerable. It may be vulnerable as a device itself, but it's not a point of entry into the network for a hacker to get onto that device or infect it with ransomware, and then segment that out for the rest of the network. So we use like technologies like ICE, for example. So when we have companies that we partner with and go out and scan and identify all these vulnerabilities on different types of medical equipment, we can then take all that data and then create something called an ICE profile, which then allows us to be able to figure out what that device is. Is the posture of the device correct? Should we, not let it on the network, let it on the network? Does it have the right operating system? Does it have the right patch? And then, of course, that also ties into our overall segmentation strategy using something called security group tags, which allows us to segment out the network even further. So the main thing is you want to segment off the IT network or your main hospital network where your administrators are and your users are and your doctors are from the medical things such as connected beds and connected sprinkler systems and HVAC systems and connected elevators. Everything's connected today, and you want to be able to segment it off from that network so that you can't one environment can't impact the other, and that's really critical to protect yourself.
But if I'm a CEO of a hospital, where would I even get started, right? If I'm looking at this, right? How do I know which part of my network needs it the most, right? Or is the most vulnerable? How would I, start defining that out?
So first piece is develop a kind of current state assessment of where you are, right? And so your scanning tools
From
are
a device standpoint, would I look at, from a scanning standpoint, would I look at all the devices connected to my network at first?
yeah, you do. And the technology with our partners can actually go out and scan everything. Um, and that allows me to then look at the devices and their vulnerabilities. But the software also creates a risk rating. So I can take
Ah,
the devices that have the most highest, and the way they define risk is really based on impact to patient safety.
is it like a
So
1 to 5 rating, or is it like a colored rating? How does it?
yeah, that kind of idea. It's essentially
Okay.
like yeah, it depends on the technology, right? But they all kind of rate it in a certain way, and so like five might be higher than a three. So what you want to do is you want to take the crown jewels, the devices that are most important to you, and obviously you want to segment those off, and the ones that are most highest risk, you want to see if you can patch them, and also can you segment them off as well. And you do the same thing on the IT side of the house, right? You look for what's most impactful. For example, a payroll system for a hospital or a system where I collect credit card data, that's also subject to, say, PCI compliance, would be more critical for me to protect than a server that has web information that is completely public information with nothing confidential on it. And in security, the main thing is you never spend the same amount on everything. You determine its worth to the business, and then you
Oh,
spend a
interesting.
different amount of money based on the value of that asset to the organization.
Like your data or your backup.
Like your data, your backups, whatever it happened, your MRI machine, whatever is most critical to you. I would spend more protecting something like that. In the business world, we look at it from a revenue generation perspective, right? Which is a little bit different than in
Interesting.
healthcare. So, for example, if I have a web server that generates $5 million worth of shoes a day in revenue, I wouldn't
I
spend
need that. I need that web server.
yeah, but I wouldn't spend more than $5 million a day in equipment to protect it because that would just be bad business. I would then decide to exit out and do
Interesting
something
theory.
different instead, right? So that's the kind of the risk approach when we look at it.
Stuart, I hear customers say, well, we work with this manufacturer and they have built this network inside our environment. We know that they still have their risks and there's loopholes there, right? Does it look at those devices as well, even though that, manufacturer of medical devices to say, hey, we built this out like a GE example. Um, are we still looking at those devices? Should we trust that that company has the security standards that we require?
I mean, my experience has been that there hasn't really been any kind of regulated standards, and they're slowly coming out with them now, right? You're seeing stuff from the FDA and others. So, without actually having standards or requirements in place, a lot of these companies haven't really thought about security when they configure the devices in the first place. And even so, there may be able, it's always good to have an outside body try to hack those devices just to see whether in fact they are vulnerable because an outsider may use different tools or different ways of actually looking at a specific vulnerability in a device than the manufacturer may. So because of lack of standards that we've had in the industry historically, and especially legacy equipment that was never designed to be connected to the internet in the first place, and all of a sudden now is connected.
Or
That's
disconnects and connects.
you
They
wouldn't,
take it home and could be
yeah,
a multitude of things.
but you wouldn't have actually have like designed security for that because you wouldn't have thought of it because it's not designed to be connected to the internet, and now all of a sudden that it is, and that's a huge problem. I mean, I see that in the industrial sector, manufacturing, nuclear, where they have the 50-year life cycle, stuff made back in the 70s that was never designed to be connected to the internet, right? Those are all big challenges. And so how do you secure that old stuff, right? And the reason why we're opening all this stuff up is obviously because we want to have better data, right? You want to understand that patient who's sitting on the bed, how often they're moving around. We want to be able to do remote care. You want to be able to see them through cameras, and all that stuff can be hacked, right? So you want to make sure that the patient is protected and that they have the best connected experience.
Yeah, and Stu, would you give the same advice to large enterprises versus small doctor's offices? Like, would you say that you should address this, a doctor who has a couple doctors in the practice, would you recommend the same for them?
So, it's funny, I often get people that say, well, this is my computer.
Honestly,
This is my computer at home. I'm just a personal guy, one person working at home. Like, why would they care about me versus a massive company? But the reality is when I'm scanning, I don't really know who you are. I'm just scanning everybody and everything, and everybody's vulnerable. And you'll actually see that a lot of smaller organizations won't invest the money because they figure they're too small, they're not going to be attacked. But those are great targets because they haven't invested and they can be attacked. And critical data is critical data. It doesn't really matter where it resides or how big you are. Everybody is vulnerable. Now, would I recommend that, a small medical practice invest the same amount of money as a large hospital? No. But again, it comes down to the value of the asset. How much revenue does it generate for you? What are what's the impact, to your business if the data was stolen? Would you be sued? Um, you know, would you be out of business? Possibly. Those are all considerations that you have to take when you decide how much you actually want to invest.
it's great advice, even, someone in those smaller offices, right? Spend a little money, look at the revenue, like Stu's saying, invest in, you know, VPNs or whatever software you feel like you need, just to start instituting some of the security practices and protect the data. And,
Right.
I think that is a great advice. Stu, what do you think about policy though? If there was regulations around it, do you think that it would help? Do you think that people would turn away from it? Like I always think about, bigger government kind of coming in and making rules or making advices. Do you think that it needs it at this point? You think that would be helpful?
Yeah, 100%. I think that
Okay.
you know, the biggest push in the security business has always been audit and regulatory compliance because it's not discretionary spend.
Mhm.
And you have to do it or else you'll be fined. And it's a way of creating standardization in the industry so that you can ensure that the public, that when you're dealing with that hospital, you can feel confident that they have certain basic controls in place and that your credit card information, that your personal health data is not going to be compromised because they have good hygiene. And that's really critical. And the only way to force that expenditure on hygiene is to have some sort of regulatory requirement or some sort of, audit check to make sure that you're in fact doing what you're doing. I see that a lot with companies that they want to do business with other companies and they require them to have a certain level of, maturity and a certain level of healthcare, uh, you know, uh, hygiene within their environment. So I would say that's definitely critical for sure.
Right. And as end users, you go to these hospitals, you want your information secure. You don't want your information leaked. It goes both ways. So,
Right.
just kind of think about that. Think about, businesses you do business with from a personal perspective, right? That those pieces are all very important and all key.
Yep.
And you want to feel safe, right? In a number of ways. You want to feel safe at the hospital. You want to feel safe going in, and you want to make sure that you're getting the best care, right? And they're spending money doing that, right?
Yep.
Um, Stu, what about giving advice? Like we hear these terminology, zero trust. What does that mean? I know we all define zero trust different ways, especially in the manufacturing space and especially, some of our partners, but can you define it, as Cisco would and
So,
help listeners understand? Yeah.
you're right. I
Mhm.
mean, when Forrester first came out with that, it became kind of a big buzzword, and everybody was trying to figure out, what does zero trust really mean? At its most simplistic level, we always knew that the insider was the biggest threat, especially as a hacker. I mean, open networks, we trusted employees. They came on with onboarding agreements, when they signed on and confidentiality agreements that, we
And
sign
we
at
all
Cisco
read
and
them.
everyone else, right? And
We read
so
every line in that.
yeah, and so we trust people, right? But I knew an organization not far from where I live where it was a healthcare organization where the administrator, person that was at a computer, knew full well the right security practices, had all the right training, they had all the technology in place, but they were also being blackmailed. And so they were basically told to get some information that the blackmailing person needed. And what they did was they took a picture with their camera of the screen and walked out of the building. Now, no firewall, no nothing is going to protect you in some sort of incident, instance like that, right? So, um, in that case, it's really, it's really, really critical to make sure that you're well protected, and that that you have the right policies in place, and procedures. And the other thing is, you can't, from a policy perspective, you can't enforce something unless there's a law, right? I mean, that's the way it is, right? You can't find somebody for speeding if you don't have a law against speeding. You can't do anything in your organization if you don't have a policy, a standard, a guideline for people to follow to be able to protect themselves, right? So all of that needs to be in place for your environment. So.
Yeah, and so it makes a good point. You could, you should just, it's hard to trust. It's hard to trust employees, but you could do so much, but you always have that human element. And
Well, yeah.
you know,
So along the zero trust, so the idea is that, um, giving the example of the person that stole data with their camera, that's where we trusted people internally, but it could always be an issue. And so historically, we trusted people on the inside. We didn't really protect our inside environments as well, but we put up a big barrier to protect ourselves from the outside world. And so, from a zero trust perspective, what we basically said was, let's not trust anybody, inside or outside. And let's not just trust people who are authenticating. Let's not trust things. Let's not trust applications. And more than that, once we actually trust something, how do I know that I can continue to trust you? So let's always re-verify and make sure, in fact, that I do actually trust you, right? And so that's where, you need technology to be able to implement that, and constantly, check to make sure, okay, John logged in at 2 a.m. from another country where, doesn't normally log in. That's odd behavior. Let's catch that, prompt a re-authentication again, and make sure that they are, in fact, who they are, right? So that's really kind of what zero trust. There's different technologies and ways of implementing it, but that's what zero trust is at its most simple,
that's a
simplistic level.
good point. Even for new devices coming on the network, you're plugging them in, right? They should go through a checkpoint. There should be a process. There should be pieces that the network will know, or as you institute segmentation, that those devices should know. It should go through checks and balances. There should be policies in place to define those devices, right?
Yeah.
All of that goes into this puzzle of segmentation or zero trust, right? Because we go from segmentation and leads into zero trust.
Yeah.
It's a very popular topic. Any other advice you want to give just in regards to segmentation? If, a CEO or a C-level executive is listening, we run through these strategies a lot. We give advice of, making sure they're not working in silos, that they're working as a full, business approach, right? That means networking, security teams, device teams, right? Everyone is included in strategies, but is there any, advice outside of that?
I mean, the main thing is, visibility is key, right? You don't know if you have a problem if you don't have the right visibility. A lot of healthcare providers have invested in a ton of different technology, but they don't work together. And so you don't really have that single pane of glass to be able to really know kind of what's going on. And then also, proper investments to be able to um, analyze what's going on, having the right staff or having the right trusted partner that can actually help you investigate what's actually going on. The other thing that's really critical too, of course, is, communication with your stakeholders, communication with the board, communication with the business, and, what doctors need, what nurses need, what's required, how is the hospital changing, and then how can you help enable that through a secure strategy, right? That includes segmentation, right? And other elements, zero trust, etc. The main idea is that security, quite often gets invited to the party last because they're thought as being an inhibitor, but really security is a business enabler, right? You can generate more revenue because your um, customers feel more secure in buying shoes from your website because they're not going to be hacked when they put in their credit card information, right? You can have your patients feel more confident that the credit card information they just gave you is going to be secured because you have the right controls in place, and you can have a good experience and go back to that hospital again because you feel like, would you go back to a hospital if you had your medical equipment hacked right in the middle of your surgery?
No.
Probably not. The element of trust is not there, right? And that's really what's key.
And that note, that was great advice. And anyone listening, if they want to get in touch with Stu, obviously you can find him on LinkedIn, and in the notes section, I'll put his link. Stu, anyone listening, it gets them thinking. I'm sure it gets them worried. But one question I get asked, and this is, kind of outside of segmentation, how do you stay up to date on companies deploying, companies like getting into the security sector, or companies, advice, or, any kind of like news that they could read about the technology industry? It feels like there's so many advances happening so fast. How do you stay up to date on the news?
So, I mean, multiple different sources. I get daily feeds, and we can put some of those links in as well. But
Yeah, that would be great.
yeah, I get like daily feeds on security breaches that are going on. I tend to read from multiple different sources. Talos, our own threat organization, also comes out with alerts all the time. Um, you
What
know,
about
it
publications? Is there any one that you rely on that you trust the most?
as
Or is
far
it
as
just a publication like
oh,
magazines, digital, right? Any digital newsletters that you receive?
there's some good hacker forums that I rely on as well. I get a lot of stuff through Twitter too. Twitter is an excellent source of information.
Mhm.
Um, the main idea is to read as much as you can from different sources, right? So you're getting a kind of a hopefully a more kind of clearer view of what's really going on. As far as new companies coming out,
Yeah.
and new types of offerings, I mean, a lot of that just being in the industry, I hear about things and other partners and customers mentioning, they're using this particular vendor or that vendor. There's a ton of new companies coming out of Tel Aviv. In Israel, that are, kind of the Silicon Valley, I guess, of the Middle East, where they're coming out with incredible stuff. Like, for example, rail industry security, right? And so, how do you protect because railroads, you think they have thousands of miles of track that can, somebody can open a box in the middle of a farm field that's, thousands of miles away and hack into the network and derail a train. There's like so much stuff. Like there's a lot of companies that are there doing really interesting stuff. We bought Kenna, which allows us to um, take in vulnerability information. And when we scan, let's say, a hospital and we get, 10,000 vulnerabilities, how do you know which ones you should actually look at? So Canon allows us to take all that data, put it up into the cloud, and they can correlate that against global threat intelligence and say, well, these are the most attacked things right now. So you need to address that first. So there's different companies out there doing a lot of kind of really cool stuff. Security business is moving fast for sure, but basic security hasn't really changed. I mean, so basic security is
Okay.
always the same, right? It's the same kind of idea, protection of data is what it's all about, and your risk tolerance, right? So, for example, you can lock down everything and trust nothing, but you won't be able to do business. Or as you start to enable systems and enable and introduce some risk and turn systems on, you then obviously have some risk to attack, but there's that fine balance between how much do you lock down and how much do you not lock down to be able to actually do stuff, right? And so you have to maintain security and visibility at all times to be able to do that.
Great advice, Stu. It's so interesting, such an interesting landscape. You heard Stu in the beginning of the chat talk about there's 3 million, is it 3 million jobs that we need? There's 3 million security openings.
Yep.
If you have an interest in it, or this, you kind of get thoughts about, being in the security industry, there's a bunch of different areas to focus on. So I'd recommend anyone just kind of doing some research, figuring out like which part of the security um, landscape that interests you, right? And we need folks from all different sides, the operational, more the tech side, more the education side, more to vet vendors. Like there's a lot here. There's a lot of plays. So I would say anyone listening, definitely give it a whirl, or take a class, or go on YouTube and do some research. That's how,
Absolutely.
sometimes how we learn, right? Any last comments, Stu? I love this conversation. I've been talking about segmentation now for a couple months, but any last words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is especially in today's climate with still COVID, and there's going to, there's, from what I hear, there's going to be a lot of cyber attacks coming
Yeah.
against the Americas. It's definitely critical to remain vigilant. Make sure that you patch your systems. Make sure that you have the right visibility to be able to detect threats. And that's not just, traditional kind of rules-based technology. You need to have that machine learning, that artificial intelligence. You need to have endpoint protection, such as with our Cisco AMP. You need to have that east-west traffic visibility, such as with our StealthWatch technologies. You need to be able to protect your workloads in the cloud. And you need to make sure that security, and this is the most important thing, that security is embedded into all of your projects right from the beginning. Should not be
Yep.
an afterthought, right? Don't come to the security team after and say, oh, by the way, we created this great system. Can you provide your blessing on it before we send it out the door and make it public? It's like, no, invite security right at the very beginning of the project so you can make sure that any costs that you need to incur to make sure that things are secure, that security is embedded into that before it ships out the door, before it becomes publicly available.
Great advice. And get thought leadership, from your manufacturers or your partners, get advice. There's a lot of pieces here. Any customer listening, Cisco's great in this space. Obviously, Talos being the second largest security company in the world. We know a lot, we understand a lot, we understand vulnerabilities. But if you want to get in touch with Stu, like I said, we'll put his contact information in the notes. And Stu, thank you for being on the show. I loved having you. I very much enjoyed this conversation. It's very educational.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no problem. And this is the Motivity Podcast with Danielle, and I hope you guys have a great day.